This opportunity before us is to have a look at and chat about where Zionism is today and where it might be headed. We're delighted that two of our Center for Israel Education board members are joining us, Mauricio Friedman from Mexico City and Steven Bayme from the New York metropolitan area. We need to brag because the CIE board, 11 of the 15 members are themselves educators or those who have been involved in the past in Israel education, either in the academic realm or in the public policy realm or in the teaching realm. So it's a great pleasure to be with Mauricio and Steven.
The temptation is obviously we're living at a particular moment. We're meeting a particular moment of high drama in terms of the future of Israel. None of us are prophets to be able to predict the future. What I think is instructive, though, is if we take a look at the past and in what ways Zionism has affected what might be called the contemporary Jewish scene. 1948 changed the map and meaning of what being a Jew meant, what Jewish peoplehood meant. Those changes are, number one, irrevocable, and number two, taken as a whole, they've altered the Jewish condition in unquestionably positive ways. After 2,000 years of statelessness, the Jewish return to sovereignty and statehood constitutes the success narrative of modern Jewish history, if not of all of Jewish history. What are those changes? How have they taken place? And how do they affect the contemporary situation? Everyone has their if-only scenario with respect to the Holocaust. My if-only is very simple. If only the Jewish state had been created in 1938 as opposed to 1948. It's not as if the Holocaust would not have taken place, but its dimensions would have been sharply mitigated. So in that respect, on a very elementary, simple basis, Zionism, in its success of creating a Jewish state, alters the entire map of what the Jewish condition looks like. Now, it presents the Jewish people with new challenges. One challenge, very simply, is the question of the return of the Jews to power, to sovereignty, to be able to be masters of their own destiny, creates in itself new challenges. Under what circumstances is the use of power justified? Under what circumstances is it excessive? Israel, over its 75 years, has known both. There have been wars that clearly were defensive wars, wars for Jewish survival, and part of the great success of Zionism is that those wars were fought to a successful conclusion. There have been other actions that suggest that the ethics of Jewish power remains a work in progress, that we've not yet figured out exactly under what circumstances the Jewish exercise of power has been harnessed for wise purposes and ethical ends. A young state with only 75 years of history behind it is going to venture into territory that in some respects is unprecedented for it. Jewish people have not known the use of power for 2,000 years. The first challenge that Zionism has presented us is what are the ethics of power, what are its wise uses, and what are its unwise uses. Second, this question of power also presents an incredible challenge. As masters of our own destiny, can Israel create a society that on the one hand adheres to Judaic principles and is able to marry those principles with the finest principles of a liberal democracy? Can it assert both the minority rights of individuals living within the Jewish state, while at the same time upholding classical principles of Jewish tradition? Thirdly, the map of Jewish peoplehood has been changed. On the one hand, what Israel has meant is to give meaning of an age-old Jewish tradition of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lezeh. All Jews are responsible for one another. That affects both diaspora Jewry, it affects the Jews in the state of Israel. In the diaspora, taking responsibility for the fate of all Jews means the responsibility to mount the case that Israel is a positive development in contemporary history. It means mounting the case for Israel as a Jewish democracy. In Israel, the responsibility towards the diaspora has been vindicated by history in terms of rescue. The rescue of Ethiopian Jewry, for example, is one of the finest chapters of Israel's history. It also should give the lie to the canard that Zionism is racism. A group of Jews who are of a different race have had very different traditions, very different customs, very little connection with Jews worldwide. Israel took responsibility for rescuing them first and absorbing them into Israeli society. Again, a work still in progress, but the rescue of Ethiopian Jewry is a shining illustration of this principle of mutual responsibility between Jews worldwide, between Israel and the diaspora. Last, I'd suggest there's a new meaning of Jewish identity that Israel has nurtured. And that meaning of Jewish identity is that to be a Jew today in 2023 suggests some connection with the state of Israel, some connection with Israel as a living Jewish entity. The birthright program is a particularly good example because it's essentially its philosophical basis is that being a Jew in the 21st century, part of Jewish education, the right of every Jew in the 21st century is an opportunity to visit the one vibrant living Jewish state that has come up in the last 2,000 years. That's an incredible philosophical statement about what birthright means. Bottom line is that Israel largely has been a success story. In other cases, it's been a work in progress. But what is indisputable is that the coming into being of Israel in 1948 has irrevocably altered the map and meaning of Jewish peoplehood today.
I'm going to take a slightly different perspective from Steven's. As he said, we can't see the future. We can go and see the past and try to see what was accomplished and what wasn't. If you want to try to see the common denominator of all the Zionist idea, safeguard Jewish life and culture, to be subjects of their own history instead of objects of other people's history, I think that was accomplished. That's a success. Sovereignty, of course, that was also a success. Never believe dogmatic claims that Zionism is. Zionism is not monolithic and never was. So let's try to see some of the ideas of Zionism and if they succeeded or they didn't. As a prelude to Zionism, one of the most influential texts, Auto-Emancipation from Pinsker, it's been very impactful for my education as a Zionist. Prior to Israel, Jews relied on the goodwill of other nations to grant them rights, which could and were, in fact, revoked. Zionism in Israel changed the way both non-Jews and Jews view the Jewish people. Status, stature, and ability to reciprocate. I want to elaborate on that. Pinsker in Auto-Emancipation talks about, in the past, how the Jewish people hunted the non-Jews because they were like a ghost, like a presence without a body. And they were, of course, like foreigners in a foreign land, a nation within a nation, or at least that's how many of the nations perceived them. And he said that the problem was that the Jews couldn't reciprocate. They didn't have a home. Right now, I'm living in your home and I'm being invited by you. And I can also share the same invitation. And this, of course, changed. And it doesn't matter if you don't identify or connect with Israel. That's something that every Jew around the world understands now. Political Zionism, Herzog's success, Jewish state, his famous quotes from his memoir, 50 years from now. Of course, 51 years after that, the Jewish state came to being. The second book, 1902, where he talks about a Jewish utopia. There's inescapable tensions between ideals and reality. Jewish, diasporic, and rabbinical values, when we had no power, were minorities, versus the intricacies of the Middle East and having statehood and having power. Ben-Gurion also said this: Israel will prove itself not by material wealth, military might, or technical achievement, but by its moral character and human values. So I think this is part of the challenges yet, and it's not something that, let's say, Israelis or Jews wanted it, but they were kind of cornered into it. I think that's something to be discussed. I quote Zohar Raviv saying Israel is not an ideal state, but a state of ideas. It's something that inspires me, and I believe. Another perspective, the secular Zionism, Berdichevsky inspired Chaim Brenner and, of course, David Ben-Gurion. They were convinced that Orthodox Judaism would be confined to museums and history books. And Berdichevsky said in one of his books, everyone faces this choice to be part of the first Hebrews or the last Jews. And of course, they were wrong. Current demographics prove Israel is much more religious, much more conservative, much more Sephardic. And I'm saying that without bias. Those are the numbers. The Zionist perspectives of Cook and Reines. Israel as a holy sanctuary, first built without sanctity, bricks and mortar, then sanctified. The beginning of redemption, Atchalat de Geula. They believed they were in this moment in time after Galut, but before Mashiach. According to Chidush report in 2022, 20% of the Israeli population are Dati Leumi, national religious, and they're a highly influential and committed ideology in all aspects of Israeli life and politics. We have the cultural perspectives of cultural Zionism, Ahadam, of course. I believe that Israel is the engine that drives Jewish civilization and culture. Jewish spiritual renewal movements are more present in Israel than in any other community in the world. I can just mention two important cultural initiatives, 929 Tanakh B'Yachad by Benny Lau and Alma, Home for Hebrew Culture by Ruth Calderon. And now I just want to focus a couple of slides on Israel and Jewish identity and education. Modernity reduced Judaism to a religion. Zionism strived to build the Jewish state and also the Jewish nation, Libnot u'Leibanot. It restored Judaism to the stature of highly developed and sophisticated civilization. So I think it fills many Jews, at least diaspora Jews, for sure Mexican Jews, with pride, adds new gateways to nurture Jewish identity and find meaning and purpose in the Jewish condition. And last, I want to talk about Israel and culturalism. Humans shape culture, which in turn shapes humans. So many people ask, how will future generations connect, identify, and understand Israel? And I always tell teachers, when you ask this question, looks like the answer has nothing to do with you and has everything to do with you. As once Rav Sachs said, we are the stories we tell about ourselves. What stories about Israel's centrality and meaning to the Jewish people will you tell future generations?
I agree with everything Mauricio said. Zionism from day one had different wings within it. Those different wings represented serious disagreements over the approach to the outside world. Herzog was optimistic that the Gentiles would come to the assistance of the Jews because anti-Semitism was a problem for them as well, as opposed to Pinsker, who was incredibly pessimistic and said the Jews must do it themselves. That's why he titles his book Auto-Emancipation. Religious Zionism disagreed with both of them, arguing that you cannot have a Jewish state based upon politics alone. In other words, the Jewish state was not only for the purposes of refuge, but was for building an authentic Jewish culture. That authentic Jewish culture was defined in exclusively religious terms. Ahad Ha'am, in his own way, agreed with that, but argued that Jewish culture is neither religious nor secular, it's a totality, and he placed the emphasis upon reviving Jewish culture, Hebrew language, Hebrew literature, Jewish music, as would strengthen Jewish life everywhere in the diaspora. And this, I think, is the point we need to underscore and internalize for ourselves. To what extent has Israel, Zionism, strengthened Jewish pride, strengthened the identification of Jews as Jews, wherever they happen to be living? Herzog believed in the withering away of the diaspora. Ahad Ha'am argued the diaspora is always going to be with us. Those tensions, I suggest, continue to be with us down into 2023.
There's always been a relationship between Eretz Israel and the diaspora, whether it's a big or a small diaspora, whether it's a big or small Eretz Israel. Most Jews have voted with their feet. Most of them have decided they're going to stay where they are. There's very little massive immigration that's going to take place. At least that's where we are today. That can always change. Zionism, Shlomo Avineri tells us, the great Hebrew University political scientist, is not only a movement, Zionism is a move. It's a move. We're not in a post-Zionist period, are we? Is Zionism more active, more vibrant today after 48 than it was before?
If the Zionist purpose was to build a state, it was accomplished. But of course, that's just one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is to have an exemplary society, a state that's not going to be a state like any other state, but it's going to be a light upon the nations. In this sense, Israel is an idea that we have to pursue and inspires us and challenges us. So I think we're not living in a post-Zionist moment. We're still getting there. Israel is not a completed piece of artwork. It's in progress, and it's fairly young for a country, 75 years. It's a lifespan of a human being. It's nothing for countries. It's different from theory to practice. It's very different from what the visionaries wanted and then the realities on the ground. And that's also tensions. Those tensions are what drives society, it drives politics, it drives humanity.
One of the ironies of recent history is that post-Zionism, the view that Zionism had run its course, we were living now in a post-Zionist era, that view was somewhat popular in the 20th century among Israeli intellectuals, basically of a mindset to be post-nationalistic. They said one nation state in the world doesn't make that much of a difference, whereas Israel needs to integrate herself into the Middle East. The collapse of Oslo pretty much put an end to that kind of post-Zionism. The irony is that it then emigrated into the United States among American Jewish intellectuals, where it continues to reside among people, for example, who support the BDS movement, delegitimizing Israel. So post-Zionism itself, I would argue, does not have much of a following in Israel, which, as Mauricio mentioned earlier, Israel's been a home really to forms of renewal of distinctively Jewish culture. In terms of what role Zionism plays, is Zionism a matter of political survival of a nation state? In that respect, Israel has faced enormous challenges, being isolated, surrounded by enemies. The quest for peace remains a quest rather than a fulfilled mission. However, the simple fact of Israel's survival over 75 years meant that no, Zionism did not end in 1948. It continues in terms of safeguarding Israel as the world's only Jewish state, the world's only Jewish democracy. The other side of Zionism, though, is what kind of a Jewish state are we talking about? And in that respect, the divisions that Mauricio alluded to, they're not only very much with us, they've gotten more explosive as time has gone on. Perhaps the hidden challenge is that there were two unanticipated consequences of 1948 that were totally off the map in 1948. One was it reversed the demographic pattern between Israel and the diaspora. From the year 722 before the Common Era, when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, more Jews have lived in the diaspora than in the state of Israel. That pattern has been reversed, is reversing itself as we speak. And certainly it's the pattern in terms of the future. Israel is the society in the world in which the number of Jews is increasing, primarily due to positive birth rates. Elsewhere in the diaspora, we're talking about a diminishing Jewish population, including here in the United States. The second unanticipated consequence is that Ben-Gurion expected the Haredi population, the ultra-Orthodox population, to disappear. That was totally mistaken. To the credit of the Haredi world, they were determined to rebuild, and they have rebuilt. But the challenge then becomes multifold. Can Israel as a Jewish state integrate a critically large Haredi population that up till now has treated the state at best in utilitarian terms, at worst as a danger to be kept at a distance? Second, if one is going to go about that task of integration, the question then becomes, what is the role of Judaism, Jewish teaching, Jewish education, Jewish values in that Jewish state? The vision of secular Zionism was ultimately that Israel become a normal nation. Can Israel develop a balance between her liberal secular values that we cherish coming out of Western-style democracies and the authentic teachings of Judaism that in many ways are very distant from liberal democratic values that have sustained us over millennia?
Isn't that what Judaism has tried to do in the last 500 or 1,000 years, to find a balance between modernity on the one hand and traditional Jewish values on the other, and try and make it from Kiddush to Kiddush, not with too much Kaddish in between?
My late teacher, Dr. Arthur Herzog, put it very well in his classic book, The Zionist Idea, that Zionism is nothing more and nothing less than one in a long series of efforts of the modern Jew to join modernity without abandoning Jewishness, to determine some point along a spectrum in which a Jew is both Jew and modern individual at the same time, and strives some synthesis between the two of them. What I think is new in this situation is that it all assumes that modernity would be a fundamental value shared by all Jews. The Haredi population was always seen as being to the side. For the first time, we are confronted with a critical mass. In Israel today, I believe it's about 13% of the population is being Haredi. As you look towards in Israel, the year 2050, where some demographers estimate that about a third of the population will be Haredi, the question will then become, will that population be integrated into a thriving, liberal, secular Jewish state, or will it remain a nation apart, a group apart?
I remain optimistic. I think that things are changing also for the Haredi society, which of course is not a monolithic society. There's also modern Orthodox, and some people are going, of course, more radical and more fanatic, but some people are embracing modernity even within their own communities. A few months ago, I thought that secular Judaism was going to be a thing of the past in Israel. And I was in Tel Aviv about a month and a half ago, and I've never seen a more secular Tel Aviv. It was Shabbat Eve, and everything was open. Cafes, restaurants, everything, and everybody was in the street. So I don't believe that's going to fade away. I think that's also gaining strength. So I think that Israelis are going to have to figure out a way to coexist.
How would you each want your students or your peers or your teachers to understand Zionism from the geographic environment in which you are operating, rather than some sort of broad concept of this is what Zionism is?
I can't speak for all of Latin America because Argentina and maybe Uruguay is a bit different, but I can speak for many of those small communities, for sure for the Mexican community. So there's this special thing about being a Jew in Mexico, for instance, this trait where you want to fit in, but you're never going to be able to fit in. It doesn't matter how Mexican you feel. You've had 2-3 generations born in Mexico. You eat enchiladas and you love the Mexican football team. Any expression of nationalism that you can think of. The Mexican population, we're always going to look at us as foreigners. And there's this Spanish-Mexican jargon called güero, which is a blonde. Everybody that's not a mestizo is a güero. It's very difficult to feel part of another nation when the nation doesn't feel you're part of it. Many of the Mexican Jewry, they want to really belong to the Mexican people, the Mexican nation, and they can't for many, many reasons. So Israel, it's there, and the idea of nationhood for Mexican Jews is very important. I'm not saying Mexicans believe they're Israelis, of course, but they certainly identify as Jews from a Jewish people. So Israel is a huge part of Jewish education in Mexico.
And Israel is a magnet.
Yes. 95% of the children go to Jewish day school. Most of them will travel to Israel by the time they finish middle school. And many of them will travel to Israel for the gap year.
Once you cross the Rio Grande River, there are enormous differentiations. American Jewry is the largest Jewish community outside of Israel, even including Israel. The balance is pretty much 7 million each. While Israel is eclipsing American Jewry in terms of population growth, America is certainly the largest Jewish community known to diaspora Jewish history. That goes along with a number of other features. Number one is that Jews are well accepted in America, which in turn gives them enormous influence, particularly in the intellectual world, in the political world, in the financial world. And with that goes a great deal of responsibility towards the state of Israel. America is Israel's greatest friend. And as far as the American Jewish community goes, it really doesn't have anything more important to do than to maintain that close relationship, that close alliance, which never should be taken for granted. It's always subject to change. And an ever vigilant American Jewish community is in a position to safeguard it. Second, because Israel does continue to enjoy a relatively popular position within the American political culture, in poll after poll, survey after survey, Americans favor Israel over Arab adversaries. That's been the case since 1948. Given that relative popularity of Israel, American Jews feel more secure in speaking out in criticism of Israel. Sometimes that criticism is done well. More often than not, it's not done well. But the responsibility is, can you dissent from particular aspects of Israeli policy without doing damage to the American-Israel relationship? American Jewry stood up for Israel during some very difficult periods, 67 war, the 73 war. At other times, there's been greater distancing between American Jewry and Israel. Thirdly, American Jews do not go to day schools, although numbers have increased. Right now, I think it's about 30% that attend Jewish day schools. Much larger numbers have had only minimal immersion in an Israel-American Jewish relationship. Even as adults, say people my own age, only about 45% have ever set foot in the state of Israel. We've had a very poor visitation rate, much, much lower, say, than Canada, much lower than Australia, much lower than Great Britain. There are real tensions here between, is being a Jew a matter of individual identity, of what is my relationship to Judaism, to the Jewish God, or is Israel also a collective enterprise of what is my relationship to the Jewish people? It needs to be both. And I would say American Jewry has done a very fine job in terms of advocating for the political dynamic of relationship to Israel, much less so in terms of imbibing Israel as a spiritual, cultural resource for American Jews. The current controversies in Israel in terms of the future of Israeli society often provides a very strong lever of saying, why do I need a relationship to Israel when it seems so distant from American values and liberal values?
Would you try and make a distinction between teaching Jewish education as compared to Israel education?
When I was a professor of Jewish history at a university, I once had a colleague who said to me, Jewish history ends in 1948. The history of Israel since 1948 is no longer Jewish history. It's Israeli history. I disagreed vigorously. To have an appreciation of the contours of Jewish history needs to put into context also what have Jews aspired to. And with all the years of exile, they continually aspired for restoration to homeland. In that sense, one cannot divorce Israeli history from Jewish history. What I do think does need to be done is to place the modern history of Israel and modern history of Zionism into the context of modern Jewish history. The dilemma of the modern Jew is that emancipation did shatter traditional models of the Jew living at the sufferance of the Gentile world. We tried to work out various agreements between the Jewish Kehillah and the powers that be. The autonomy of the Kehillah was strictly an internal autonomy. It regulated internal Jewish matters. It had very little control over the place of the Jew in the Gentile society that was regulated by the secular Gentile governments. Emancipation shatters that because it gives Jews other options. One of the options, perhaps in many ways the most common one, becomes the Jewish love affair with liberalism. The good guys, if you will, were the liberals who emancipated the Jews. Emancipation often meant acceptance of Jews as individuals, not as a corporate community. Zionism, in many ways, is a reaction to the failure of that emancipation. If emancipation could not solve the Jewish problem, what Zionism would do is return the Jews to normalcy, to a land and language of their own. Zionism means a great deal more when it's put into the context of the modern Jewish experience. Zionism is an effort to take that vibrant Jewish civilization and put it into a modern democratic context. It's an ongoing struggle, but I think it means a lot more when it's put in that context rather than as a break in the course of Jewish history.
I don't think there's any distinction between Israeli education, Jewish education, and for that matter, Hebrew education. I think all of them have to be integral, having one outlook, one perspective of how to form Jews with different dimensions. Jewish history has been always the tension between conservation and renewal. And just as we teach a moment in Jewish history as, let's say, Sfarad, the golden age in Iberic Peninsula, and how it shaped Jewish perspectives and how it changed Jewish creativity and Jewish literature and philosophy, we should also teach Israel as a particular moment, a rupture, but a moment also of recreating Judaism around the world. And that's something that has to be done since the kindergarten. I don't think you should wait until high school. For then, you'll have kids that say, that's Israeli and that's Jewish, as Steven said. And I don't see that distinction.
We have a question from Julie. She asks, do you feel like the influence that Steve is speaking of is decreasing? I believe that several studies show decreasing numbers of Jewish students in Ivy League institutions and other sectors. Also, is the notion of privilege also decreasing Jewish influence?
When Jews are less than 2% of the population, their presence as being 20, 30, 40% of the student bodies at Ivy League universities needs to be understood as a temporary phenomenon rather than a long-term phenomenon. Yes, there are currents in the intellectual world that are working against Jewish interests and Jewish influence. Partly it has to do with one of the tragedies of Zionist history. One of the success stories is Zionism remains very popular within American public opinion. However, one of the real tragedies is that the cause of Zionism has become increasingly a conservative cause. I wish it were bipartisan. The Zionism of the 1950s and 1960s was very dear to liberal hearts. I can't say the same today. In that context, we should not be surprised. The cause of Zionism on campus clearly has taken a setback. Will that reflect itself in long-term decreased influence? Number one, part of the virtue of being in a liberal democracy is that we have the freedom to assert our own ideas. If that happens, at least let's take some responsibility for ourselves and ask, have we done our job as educators and as influencers? Second, that Zionism has become a more conservative cause is by no means irreversible. That also depends upon directions in Israel, and those play themselves out quite literally on a daily basis. Third, as American Jews become less Jewish, and that's the issue of assimilation, you have to also expect less attachment to Israel. Assimilation is very real, and it comes at a very heavy price. If you ask me what things will look like 20, 30 years down the road, historians like to look at the past and not very good at predicting the future. The Talmud had it even better. Since the destruction of the Second Temple, the gift of prophecy has been given over to knaves and fools. So this is a case really of only fools dare enter where angels fear to tread. That said, do we still have the wherewithal to raise consciousness, make the case, teach Zionism and modern Israel? Quite literally, as I said earlier, it's the success narratives of the modern Jewish experience.
It's a complex situation. I just took a group of non-Jewish teachers to Israel. We didn't want to give them any line or push any type of narrative. After a few days, they say, where's the colonial, where's the white people here? I mean, most of the Jews in Israel are Jews of color, Sephardic, Mizrahi. It's something that people need to see with their own eyes. But I think that we should not teach Israel that it's just pink and beautiful and this Zionist narrative of the ethos. There's many things that hurt, many things that cause pain. This idea of wrestling and hugging, I think that's one of the approaches that we have to teach coming generations about the realities and complexities and all the success and challenges and the things where Israel's still, in debt.
Israelis have been practicing taking charge of your own destiny for the last 75 years, defending yourselves, doing things on your own, not relying on anybody to come save you, making really difficult decisions when the three decisions in front of you are each terrible and you have to choose the least terrible of them. But I have found that American Jews struggle with particularism versus universalism. They don't practice a lot of leadership, making tough decisions, trying to gauge the future of the nation, weighing the responsibility and the burden on their shoulders of having to do that and sometimes having to sacrifice your own personal beliefs for pragmatic needs of the collective. Judaism is not a passive activity. It is something that every generation has to contribute to, preserve, and add to with your own stories in order to continue that identity.